podcast in which one man strives to level up his geekhood and helping you do the same, one battle at a time. Now, let's get geeky with Gamer Leaf.
The day dawned bright and beautiful. The night's rest had done wonders for restoring each gearlock to their full health. Cuts and abrasions had healed, and sore and weary muscles were invigorated with the thought of all the loot that was to come. Say what you will about the Ebon, but they knew how to keep their treasures full, until they ran into heroic gearlocks, of course. Pots and pans clanged, while Tink's bots tried their hands at poaching eggs, toasting bread, and cutting fruit. Boomer crouched near the shallow fire pit they dug the night previous, trying to solve the problem that ever dodged her: how to make a satisfying boom without obliterating their breakfast. Tantrum curled up on his bedroll, refusing to greet the day until it had the decency to accompany breakfast. Nugget had her kit laid out before her and was going through and organizing things. Her task, however, was often interrupted when she stopped to admire the loot she'd acquired so far. It was a small, almost pitiful amount of loot, but that was all right. Like a seed, her loot would flourish until she was swimming in it. Ghille, meanwhile, was perched upon a rock, trying to make sense of the map. It was all vaguely familiar, as they had come this way before, but so very much had happened since then, that it was almost as though they were treading new ground. However, there was one thing he was certain of: the Cibran River was going to present a challenge. It wasn't the river itself that was a problem. It was a lack of intact bridges. It also meant walking among those who were not gearlocks, which presented a problem of its own. There was no way of telling an enemy scout from an innocent traveler, not to mention all those traps that the Ebon were so fond of setting. Yes, they were going to have to approach this carefully to avoid making the same mistakes they had made on their first adventure. He had just located a possible crossing place when a muted boom sounded behind him. The force of the boom tangled his map and blew his hair into his face. "Ha ha!" Boomer laughed. "Success!" And so it was. By Boomer standards, the fire pit might have grown a little since last they dug it, but it wasn't quite a crater. The logs Tink had placed next to the pit were only partially singed, but best of all, her boom hadn't even reached their food that was waiting to be cooked. "Mind the spider bot," Tink said as he carried over the large iron skillet he'd already prepped for cooking. The sizzle it made once the fire had heated the pan was enough to draw even Tantrum's attention. "Food?" he asked hopefully. "Just a few more minutes," Tink said as his spiderbot carefully seasoned the food. "So what's up for today, Chef?" Nugget asked, sliding up next to Ghille. Did she just say chef? I think she meant chief. I bet if we really tried, we could come up with a route that didn't mean running into the Ebon. Ghille just shook his head. He didn't understand Nugget's aversion to fighting. She wasn't half bad when she put her mind to it, and how else did she think to acquire loot without fighting for it? Loot was by definition stuff people fought over and stole. He shook his map out and gestured to the long blue line snaking its way through eastern Delore. "We've got to cross somewhere. The key is figuring out where. I suppose," Nugget said after a moment's thought, "that it would be too much to assume anyone else's had learned to swim since our last crossing. Water and Tink's bots don't get along too well, Ghille said, hoping to change the subject. It wasn't that he couldn't swim. He could when he put his mind to it. It was just that the Sabron River wasn't exactly a tame river. Gearlocks just weren't made for swimming in those kind of currents. You know, Nugget tapped her chin thoughtfully. I'm really surprised he hasn't figured out a way to make them fly yet. Ghille jumped to his feet and shoved the map into his pocket. Don't go giving him any ideas. He shuddered at the memory of all the small explosions and sudden bot attacks that had happened once Tink had gotten it into his head that his bots should be mobile. It had all worked out in the end, but that's exactly where Ghille hoped such mishaps to remain in the end. Fortunately, breakfast was soon finished and revived even Tantrum. There was nothing like cooking over an open flame surrounded by your comrades and reasonably certain no one else is surrounding you. There was, however, still the matter of the river. Once they were finished with all the eating and cleaning up after themselves, Ghille laid out their options. We can either pretend to be anything but Gearlocks and hope no one notices, or we could go to the Molnor for help. He grimaced at the mention of the dastardly group. While seeking their aid had been the popular vote the last time they'd gone adventuring, there was growing sentiment that avoiding grave encounters where they might be overmatched was the wiser course. Nugget crossed her arms and glared at him. It's not that hard to tuck our ears into the hoods and lie low. I'll take that as a vote for blending in. I agree. Me too. Hey, Tantrum checked the balance and heft of his axe. The Molnor aren't so bad. So you want to ask for their help? Tantrum shrugged. Not really. Right, it's unanimous then. We're going to blend in with the commoners. It took a little longer than expected to gather together the requisite disguises. While they had cloaks for when the nights got chilly, they were brightly colored Gearlock cloaks, not the long, deepy hood brown cloaks the commoners favored. There was also the matter of the ears. I know it's unpleasant, Ghille said in a voice meant to mollify Tantrum's dark mutterings, but Grendaloo, sap, will keep our ears tucked back better than anything else. What he didn't mention and didn't even want to think about was the sap, while extremely potent, would keep their ears tucked back for a mite longer than the time it would take to cross the river, by a fortnight or two. But if that was the worst they encountered, they would be very lucky, Gearlocks indeed. It took most of the morning to get ready, but just before midday the Gearlocks had all lined up for their final inspection. Remember, Ghille cautioned, look like a commoner, walk like a commoner. For the time being, forget that you are a mighty and proud Gearlock. This pronouncement was met with more mutterings, but they were muted and soon fell silent. Right then, Ghille turned. The butterflies in his stomach had turned into a blizzard of pale wings. Let's get on with this, then, shall we? They dutifully marched through the clearing until they found the path that would lead them onward to a small village near the river, where the boats were kept for crossing. At first they encountered nothing more dangerous than a few deer, followed shortly by frequent squirrel sightings. Then, bit by bit, they began running into people here and there. First were the merchants who were eagerly traveling the road, knowing there was fairly secluded village at the end of it. Then there began to be more and more people until, at last, a Gearlock couldn't turn left or right without having his or her arm josted by someone or other. Ghille kept a wary eye for spies and snitches, trusting the rest of his band could keep Tantrum from, tantruming every time someone bumped into him. It wasn't until the sun had reached its zenith that they finally made it to a small, rather unimpressive dock the village kept. It had a modest pier that connect land to boat and little else, but that was perhaps the point. "All right," he murmured under his breath. "Just pay the boatmaster and we'll be on our way." Ghille hadn't yet seen hide nor hair of anyone that looked like they might be a spy when they weren't a villager. But that meant nothing. The best spies, he'd heard, could pretend to be anything they liked and make you believe it. For a change, luck smiled down on them, and he was able to procure 5 tickets without incident. Even so, Ghille didn't let his guard down. His gaze swept the docks for even the slightest hint of a spy. He wouldn't be able to breathe easy until they landed on the other side, and from the stiff postures of his band, they would be hard-pressed to relax until then as well. "Ah," a portly man with a big hat and a wide smile greeted them. "And where might you be headed this fine morn?" "We're looking for work," Ghille said, at the same time as Nugget, who said something about bringing a basket to the poor sick grandma. "Eh?" The man's smile didn't so much as waver, and yet it seemed as though his attention had sharpened. "Which is it?" Ghille sighed. The blizzard of butterflies in his gut were doing their best to turn into an extinction-level event. He pointed to Tink and Tantrum. "We're looking for work while our sisters are visiting with our dear old grandma." He glared at Nugget, but she just smiled at him. "You'll have to excuse my curiosity," the man said, doffing his hat and bowing. "In these troubled times, one can never be too careful." Ghille nodded, his eyes narrowing. "Agreed. You know our business. Might we inquire of yours?" "Mine?" The man's grin widened. "My most humble apologies. I thought you knew. I am the one who will be ferrying you across the Cibran this most beautiful of days." "Does that mean we can get on the boat now?" Boomer asked, eyes wide. She had a kind of a love-hate relationship with water that came from sinking like a stone every time she tried to swim. Their captain laughed. "Good to see enthusiasm among the ranks. Yes, yes, you shall be the first that I ferry across today." "Almost there," Ghille reminded himself. Once they were on the boat, it was only a matter of time to cross the Cibran and be on their way. They just had to avoid detection a little while longer. One by one, the gearlocks climbed aboard a rather gaudy-looking vessel that proclaimed itself the river's own maiden on the side of the lurid gold lettering. Look, Nugget, Boomer said, pointing to a large bird with the stick-like legs on the farther shore. "Aren't they beautiful?" Nugget grumbled something before covering her mouth with her hands and going to an unhealthy shade of green. "Isn't this exciting?" Tink asked, practically bouncing in place. His bots were tucked securely in his bag where no prying eyes could see them, but that didn't stop him from sharing each and every detail with them. Tantrum simply crossed his arms and waited silently. A few more passengers boarded before the captain declared the boat filled to capacity. Then the 2 men on either side of the boat dipped their long paddles into the water and began the arduous task of turning the vessel before rowing downstream. Ghille leaned out into the wind. To the casual observer, he might have been mistaken for one who was invigorated by the breeze that swept down the river. In reality, he was still on the lookout for traps and spies. The traps he'd have to rely on Nugget or one of the others spotting, but the spies he could smell. There was something that came from serving the Ebon that left a sink of darkness clinging to a person, no matter how hard they scrubbed. But the wind was blowing against them, and there was no room on the other end of the boat. And no matter how hard he stared, the other passengers, there were 5 in all, looked and acted like ordinary people. Perhaps their luck had changed for the better. Perhaps he was looking for shadows that weren't there. And perhaps the pigs running loose in the Daylore forest would all sprout wings and flutter into the sky like porcupine birds. "What's wrong, boss?" Tantrum asked. Ghille shook his head. "I don't know." "Then stop looking so paranoid. The others are starting to notice." Ghille blinked in surprise, but Tantrum had spoken true. The other passengers had quietly minded their own business before, but they were casting about curious looks on their own, specifically to where Boomer, Nugget, and Tink were standing. He nodded and took a few deep breaths. This ordeal was almost over. A few more minutes, and there, the boat bumped gently against the pier. On the opposite side of the river, the captain gave the orders for the rowers to drop and anchor to secure the lines. One of the men who rowed them across rolled his eyes, but dropped the large silver anchor over the side of the vessel. It splashed against the water and then shimmered against the sunlight from where it lay amongst the sand and the rocky bottom of the river. Ghille nearly laughed with relief as they began to disembark. While those pesky butterflies had tangled his stomach into knots, they'd done it. They'd made it all the way to the other bank without anyone suspecting. Beep, bop, boop. Everyone froze as a pale light appeared pressed up against the side of Tink's pack. The spider bot shook a little as it repeated its bops and boops. "Well, come on then," the captain's voice boomed out as he shepherded his passengers off the dock. "While it's been a pleasure, there are others waiting on the same ride. Ghille ushered the gearlocks off the boat, keeping them close as they ducked their heads and walked on the dock onto the solid ground. "Sorry," Tink whispered his apology. "I thought I'd set Spiderbot's nap setting to the last until evening. I don't know what got into her." "Just keep walking," Ghille muttered as they all dispersed. None of the gearlocks dared to breathe until they made it to the edge of the tree line. The other passengers had given them odd looks, but no one had stopped them, and more importantly, no one had pointed a finger and outed them for gearlocks they were. So why did that uneasy feeling in his chest turn into iron? And why did the weight of the unseen eyes pierce him between the shoulder blades? Ghille shook his head. If they'd been sighted, then the Goblin King would surely send his minions sooner or later to intercept them. But he couldn't worry about that now. If they'd been spotted, there was nothing he could do about it now. For the time being, they'd quickly train up before moving on. Maybe this time they'd be able to outrace the bad luck he could sense gathering along the horizon. Tantrum was the first in line for training. He tried to up his attack strength but failed and ended up going for a new skill, something about like a wolf. Ghille, while aware of his weak spots, rolled for defense and managed to upgrade his defense shield from 1 to 2. Tink, following suit, also increased his defense shield from 1 to a 2. Nugget also put strength into her defense and raised it up to a level 2. Finally, Boomer, who was anxiously waiting to blow something up, did a round of exercises that strengthened her attack and raised it from a 3 to a 4. As they hunkered down to sleep later that evening, Ghille couldn't shake the feeling that the Goblin King was not only aware of their movements, but that he was one step ahead of them. That night, they all dreamed of silver wolves howling at the golden moon, and within the shadows and lines of the moon, a pale face with dark eyes stared down at them. No need to hurry. The Goblin King's voice cut through them like an Arctic wind. "I'm coming to you." To be continued next Monday on Rolling with the Leaves, Season 2, Episode 4, as this was Episode 3. Did you all miss any of the other episodes? Well, don't worry. Our show notes will go ahead and have links to those. This is Getting Geeky with Game Relief. Now on to You guessed it, Kickstarter Corner. We won't have the intro as we've got to get this episode up for you. But a couple of quick games. We got Swordcrafters. Craft 2D game pieces into a 3D sword. Tile selection and placement board game where each player builds a 3D tableau of a shape of a sword. And this goes through Tuesday, March 20th at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. So it's almost over. So if you want to get that one and make a sword and play a fun game, go ahead and make sure you back that on the Kickstarters. And then we've also got Liminal RPG. Liminal is a self-contained tabletop role-playing game about people caught in between the everyday modern world and the world of magic. They've got 11 days to go at the time of recording, so they end on Thursday, March 29th. We will have the creator on as an interview, so make sure you listen for that coming up in the coming week probably. Then, don't forget to discover Fractured Zombies. Fractured Zombies is a card game involving letter cards designed by a dyslexic, also involving chainsaws, guts, brains, and severed hands. This is for, I'd say, 14 and up or whatnot. But yeah, they've got a while to go through the 1st of May, and they got about $1,000 to raise, so check that one out, definitely. And then, last but not least, we've got Chronicles of Crime. It's a cooperative game of crime investigation, mixing board game and virtual reality. This one goes through Tuesday, March 20th at 4 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. So make sure you go check out Chronicles of Crime, as that one almost ended, as well as Swordcrafters. And you got to get on with your life. We got to get on with our lives. So go ahead and do that. But get geeky, stay geeky, and bring others into the geek fold. And we will catch y'all on the, you guessed it, flip side. Gamer Leaf out.
Gamer Leaf levels up. Tune in next week to see if Gamer Leaf's luck holds up.